This episode of Game Masters Hall is sponsored by The Deck of Many and Level Up Dice.
Hey there, welcome to Game Masters Hall. I'm David Nett, and today I am joined by Jasmine Bhullar, and we're going to talk about visualizing the fantastic. Hey Jasmine.
Hi!
Thank you so much for joining me.
I'm so excited to see you again.
Thank you, me too. Can we lean in and hug? Is that okay?
Course,
There we go.
yes.
Boom, right there.
Oh!
I see you so rarely, so it's so nice to...
I know. We get to nerd
Awesome.
out about
Yes.
Game Master things.
About spells and the fantastic today, visualizing the fantastic. So part of the reason, I wanted to ask you questions about visualizing the fantastic because I've worked with you a little bit. You are an incredibly descriptive storyteller. Like that's one of my favorite things, watching you and working with you. And so I wanted to ask you about this thing that we do, playing in these fantasy worlds and in horror games and stuff. Part of our job is setting a scene for the players so they feel like they're real and part of the world. And like the first question I have for you is, when you first started game mastering, did you find that difficult? Like what was the thing that brought you into being able to do this beautiful thing that you do, describing and setting the worlds for people?
Yeah. I think that for me, it was never difficult.
Oh, nice.
And the reason is because I didn't come into this when watching other people play.
Okay.
And so I never felt this pressure to perform. I belong to a school of thought that there are two types of GMs. There are performative GMs, and they're wonderful and they're great. And then there's GMs that perform less and talk more. I'm one of those people that I might not be like, it was a dark and stormy night. I try to set that verbally as opposed to doing it more physically, if that makes sense. And I feel like that actually made me feel more comfortable when I first started GMing because there wasn't as much room to feel foolish.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think a lot of us, for the first time when we sit down and we first start playing a game with our friends for the first time, there's like this tension of nobody wants to be the one that feels kind of goofy or silly, like make-believing, because that's ultimately what we do. And so for me, almost approaching it from the point of view of a wannabe writer, that's how I entered it, was describing things the way I would in a novel.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, but taking the step beyond that is kind of describing things like you would in a novel, setting the scene for people. The worlds that we spend a lot of time in are worlds that include a lot of unreality, the horror worlds and the fantasy worlds and stuff like that. So describing magical things and describing things that don't exist, don't have a strong reference point in the real world is part of our job.
Yeah.
Do you find that it's difficult to paint a picture for your players that is the same one that you have in your head when you're talking about like a magical spell or a magical creature?
Oh, for sure. And a lot of the times I try to put the onus on the player to describe what they're doing.
Okay.
That way they have that space to sort of explore what they think their successes and failures look like. I always feel like what we each visualize in our own heads is really different. But that's also the beauty of something like role-playing versus a medium like film or television is our headcanons, as we call them, are all different.
Right.
And so something that I usually do, and I'm sure you've probably noticed this from working with me, is I try to pull on collected experiences. I don't usually have like very hard descriptors of like, this thing has tentacles and it's slimy and it's got 8,000 eyeballs. Usually I start with, as soon as this thing enters the room, you feel all of the heat gets sucked out of the air and the hair on the back of your neck rises up, because these are things that everyone can relate to.
I love that just in that moment. Just as you're describing to me what you would do, it was still very visceral.
Yeah, because I love gore. That's my so close in my heart.
And the other thing that I've noticed about you as a storyteller, and it was a good lesson for me in my games, is that you're not focused entirely on the visual aspect of the thing that you're describing. You're tactile about a lot of the senses, which is it's important for inclusion, especially. Was that something also that was natural to you? I remember you saying something when we were doing the vampire game. You mentioned how something smelled before you talked about anything else.
Oh yeah. I always try to set the feeling, because when you're sitting there around at a table, I feel like there's already a bunch of energy in the air. Everyone's really excited, and so to tap into that and try to bring in, how do we, especially when you're doing a horror story, how do we bring down the mood? How do we build the anticipation of the next moment?
Now, you did talk about that you a lot of times ask your players to describe things, which is one of the things that I love. I think that's something that's been happening more and more in role-playing games that I experience, is inviting that world building and that storytelling from your players. When you're dealing with like an environment or a world or a town, do you ask them to participate in that as well and visualizing that with you as well?
Especially if it's a part of the town that they come from or something that they have a connection to. I never want to step on a player's toes and make them feel like, well, since we're visiting your hometown, I'm going to describe it. Like, because I feel like they had an idea when they made their character where this person came from, and I want to give them the agency to be able to give life to that in some way, shape, or form. And then usually I use that against them. That's just me, though. And I do that with a lot of like also spells as well. So if someone gets like a nat 20, I'll usually say, wow, okay, so it does, how much damage? What does that look like? And just that small, and you immediately see people sit up straighter and get so much more excited of like, okay, well, normally when I do an Eldritch Blast, it's like this. But this time, I stand with my legs apart and put my hands up and, because
so awesome.
Yeah, it brings people in a way that they feel like they're more active participants in the story. And ultimately, that's what D&D is. It's all of us kind of like coming together and telling a story together.
Yes. And so then when you're dealing with like NPCs and villains, do you do some of the same thing? Like, because I've watched you play, I know I don't see you do a lot of they cast fireball at you or they cast this at you, but like talk about describing magic from a NPC standpoint.
Oh, yeah. I love it when the players are like, what spell is that? Because they're sitting here trying to figure out. And I love doing that with descriptors as well. Like when you describe a monster, like the players not knowing immediately, like, oh, that's a rock golem, but rather sitting there and being like, what the heck are we fighting? And having that moment or that almost like frantic of like, what does it wake to? What do we do? That's my favorite. And I do that a lot in a lot of the games I play, is not saying like, oh, he's going to cast this against you, but saying, he raises his hand. The smell of burning ozone fills the air, and before you know what is happening, the entire left side of your body, you feel searing pain. And as you frantically, swat at yourself to get it out, you realize it's left a necrotic mass on your arm. And, describing damage that way and describing spells that way, I feel like it helps people get into the story. Because I personally am not the biggest, when I describe what I do, I never say, I'm going to use Shadow Blade. I usually try to, I pull out my book, and from inside this book, I pull out this spell, and that's how I usually describe my Warlock's Tome of Spells, is she literally pulls things out of the book amazing. And then uses them. So I try to lead by example.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, because you game master that way, do you find that your players model you in that respect?
Yeah. They usually get into it and they find themselves kind of like stepping into their roles and becoming the characters. And I feel like that's how you know you've succeeded as a GM, is when everybody is just so invested at the table. What
about the the kind of the built-in magic of a world? So one of the struggles that I had as a young GM was the first time I ran an encounter through Waterdeep. And if you know Waterdeep in D&D, like there's the walking statues in the town. It's a town filled with magic. The Forgotten Realms are steeped in magic, and it's sort of commonplace magic. Statues of owlbears in the square and giant walking statues and stuff. And how do you keep that exciting and visceral when it's just commonplace fabric of the world?
I think it's when you have to do a good job. Well, in my opinion, I should probably add that. In my opinion, you have to do a good job of bringing in the unexplainable. And that's difficult to do in games where magic permeates everything. But I think having moments where it's like, oh, this isn't just a normal wizard. Like, you have to change up the game. And so usually I describe that almost as like an aura of power, and that manifests in different ways. Maybe when this person enters the room, all of the rocks in the room, maybe you're in like a cavern, all the rocks in the room start vibrating. Or, maybe if you're holding glass vials on your belt, they all shatter. And it sort of gives you like an idea of like, okay, this person has some sort of physicality or like an aura to them. Like they have almost like a telepathic force, like a dark phoenix force, type of thing. And I think it's bringing in that of like, well, we've experienced all this before. I don't know what spell this is. I don't even know what this is. And we had a similar moment, I think, in Vampire the Masquerade, when I had one of my NPCs bring in like a rat swarm. Like it's a spell that does exist. It's an ability that does exist, but describing that not as like, he uses rat swarm, but everything starts, moving, and you hear like this high-pitched squeal, and then describing it and like counting it down, and the players are like, what do we do? And 2 more rounds pass, and then suddenly, there's a swarm. Like, just I think it comes back to trying to present the explainable as unexplainable, and giving your players, having them pause for a moment and try to realign themselves of what could this be? Because I think that's where that fantastical nature comes from us not understanding something.
From the mystery.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that very much. So you just said something interesting to me. You were talking about that rat swarm that the main bad guy in that vampire sequence summoned, and then measuring that against the rounds that we're counting off. And it makes me wonder how you balance the sort of the tension and the mystery and the setting and the beauty of this, magical thing that you're doing against the mechanics of the game, which you always have to honor because you're the GM and your job is also to keep track of the rounds and the initiative if that's appropriate to the game and these other things. And how do you keep players engaged with this world that you're building at the same time as working through the mechanics?
It's tough, especially because sometimes you have to tell your players, like, okay, well, I'm pretty sure your 6 seconds of conversation has passed. And in some ways you kind of have to usher along and make sure that that things are going at the rate they are. But I also think it's incredibly important to make sure that your players have a chance to react to what is happening, because that's the essence of what makes the game fun. So usually what I do is I call it letting it breathe. Like, as soon as a mechanic takes place, or if this NPC comes in and, somebody takes a lot of damage or they use an ability that terrifies one of the party members, I try to let that breathe, usually a little bit, let everybody get a chance to react to it, and then try to toss the ball to the next person in initiative and say, how do you react?
Gotcha.
And say it I usually say it like that instead of like, what do you do? Usually like, how do you react? Do you want to help him? And try to do something like that, as opposed to just, okay, he hits you for 42 damage, you die. What do you want to do?
Right. That's a lot. The you die is we should take a moment. That's
Yeah, you have to let every moment breathe.
I think that's such good advice, because it's so easy when you're dealing with the mechanics to fall into a mechanical kind of rhythm. And I love the idea of letting that breathe, letting moments breathe. That's so cool.
Yeah.
So before we end here, I want to check in with Xander, who's with Emily of Level Up Dice.
Thanks, David. Hey, Emily.
Hi.
What do you have for me today?
Today, I want to talk about dice as collector's items.
Ah, yes, dragon
yes,
dice
get your
hoard.
hoard together.
Yeah.
So, of course, we play with our dice, and dice are made to be played with. Everything you see on this table is made to be played with. But, of course, dice are also special relics that we collect to really honor our hobby. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with buying dice just for the sake of having it on display or just for the sake of having it as part of your collection.
Whoa.
This is an example of something really special that could be in your collection. This is our caged aluminum dice.
Wow.
Starts out solid, and then our machine cores away at it until the center falls in, so it becomes two separate pieces, but they never come apart.
Wow, why?
I want you to roll this.
Okay.
And the answer is, why not?
I hear it.
Right? It's got that beautiful music to it. Just an example of something that could be a really unique addition to your collection, and there doesn't have to be a reason for it.
Sure.
Another example that I think is a really great demonstration
God.
of the weight of having good dice in your life.
Oof.
These are our
Really
tungsten dice. I know, right? It's a good workout.
Yeah. Oh, there we go.
These are the heaviest dice we offer, third heaviest solid state metal in the world.
I believe you, because I don't know any different.
And it's just another option for someone who wants to have something really hefty in their arsenal.
That makes a statement.
Yeah, absolutely. And why not make a statement with your dice? Why not collect relics that are meaningful to you? And why not honor the hobby that you love with something that will last a lifetime?
Beautiful. A great addition to any dragon hoard of dice.
Exactly.
We're going to throw it back to you, David.
Thanks, Xander and Emily. Also, our friends at the Deck of Many have these new animated spell cards, which are really cool, and you can check those out at animatedspells.com. Jasmine, thank you for doing this with me.
It's
this
always
is so much
a pleasure.
fun. Yay.
I always love hanging out with you.
And I'm a big fan as well. I mean, I adore you. We're friends, but I'm also a big fan, so I was so excited to be able to pick your brain on this topic.
I just think you're fantastic. You're like one of my mentors.
We can spend 10 minutes here complimenting each other,
could.
but we have another episode coming up, and you're going to be on it again. Tell me about what's going on.
So next week, I'm actually going to be in the host seat, and I am going to be talking with Becca Scott about balancing die.
That sounds awesome. I will be watching. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you watch next week too. We'll see you soon.